hosting this meeting from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of our Aboriginal people and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of Victoria. Our speaker today on the second episode of Jasol Talks is an exceptional woman, one that believes strongly in the power of stories and is a woman of many talents. She is an inspiring motivational speaker, a trainer and coach, and has empowered numerous individuals and organisations globally. She is the founder of Tharoor Associates, a training, coaching and organisational development company, the co-founder of Culture-lytics, and is the recipient of the Global Diversity Leadership Award at the 2017 World HRD Congress. It is my absolute honour and privilege to introduce our guest speaker, Ms. Smita Tharoor. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, pleasure.
The topic of today's discussion is the unconscious bias. And while I could give a small introduction on the topic, I don't feel like I would be doing it justice, especially in your presence. So could you give our audience a brief explanation on what the unconscious bias is, perhaps with an example of its eminence in quotidian life?
Sure. So if we just separate these two words, the unconscious and the word bias, and take the second word first, the word bias. Often when people think of that word, they think it's a prejudice or a discriminatory opinion that people have. And that's why the word bias, because that's quite often how the word bias is used. But the word bias is actually just a preference for or against a thing, a person, a group, a food, a situation. It's a preference, and it's for or against. And then when we put the first word back in, which is unconscious, essentially that means that you are jumping to a conclusion that quickly, and you have a preference for or against something, a person, a thing, a situation, a group. So for example, if I was to use you as an example of Sanskriti. So you are Australian born, you live in Melbourne. And let's imagine you happen to be on holiday in London. And as you're walking down the street, well, nobody's walking down any streets now because of Corona, but let's imagine a time that you're walking down the street. And as you're walking down the street, two people walk past you and they speak in what is clearly an Australian accent. What's your natural instinct? Your natural instinct would be to turn and to look at them. And you have this eye contact and you have this connection. And because you are clearly, have a deep connection with the country of your birth, you might even go out and say, hi, sorry, I just heard you, can we chat? Now, that first instinct that you made was a positive unconscious bias towards two complete strangers who were walking down the street. I mean, it could be all kinds of different examples, but I just thought I'd kind of make that one up to give you context in terms of how many different ways our unconscious bias can come in. I mean, very simply put, we can jump to conclusions about all kinds of things because of previous life experiences. And so you are Australian, you happen to be somewhere else, and that's part of your narrative. And therefore you are instinctively jumping to a conclusion or liking somebody or not liking somebody based on your narrative.
Absolutely. So when you speak about the unconscious bias, you mention it as something that's instinctive, something that happens instantly. For our students and in our kind of daily realm of functioning, what role does the recognition and even the mitigation, if that's possible, of this unconscious bias, what role does that play?
Gosh, I mean, it's so big. Mitigation, no. I'll start with the second part of your question first. Unconscious bias is not necessarily a bad thing. So you don't have to berate yourselves and you don't have to get rid of it, which is what you're suggesting by using the word mitigate. I think being aware of it, making unconscious into conscious would be good, because sometimes, based on the situation that you're in, you may jump to a conclusion that is unfair on the situation. It could be a person, a group, whoever it might be. And that is then unfair. So what role does it play as a student? Well, it plays a role in pretty much anything that you're doing, and depending on what you're studying, it doesn't really matter. Because if I think about you as a student, and each one of you come from very different backgrounds and influences, and think about your own narrative. Now, each of us have our own unconscious biases. So your own narrative. So some of you, because I know there are people from India and from Australia who are tuning in at the moment. So depending on which country I'm talking to, some of you will have grown up with specific ideas about inclusivity, because that's the city or the country that you were growing up in. And it could be that your parents or your grandparents had opinions about race or gender or religion or so on. It could be, for example, that you were brought up in a very patriarchal household where the men have a voice and the women don't have as much of a voice. Now, if that happens, it is so deeply embedded within you that the chances are that when you are at university, pardon me, at university and wanting to have a voice and trying to speak up in your class, you, the woman, doesn't have enough confidence because growing up in your early years, you grew up in a very patriarchal household where the women were not given a voice. So it's not a generic, simple answer because each one of us come from different stories, have different experiences, have different narratives. And what is in our unconscious, or what I call in my backpack, is not going to influence you. It's only going to influence me. So I don't know if I'm making sense on this, but it's not a simple answer because there are so many things in our lives that influence us.
So when you mention your backpack, the bias is almost something that you carry around with you. Is that correct?
That's right. So you can call it what you like, but my kind of analogy in my own head for me to understand it is what I call the backpack theory. So if you want to imagine that you're born with a backpack on your back, and as you go through life, and the reason it's a backpack is behind you, you can't see it. It's unconscious. It can't be a handbag or a box in front of you. It has to be, it's there rather than here. And as you go through life, you chuck stuff into it. And it could be all kinds of simple things. It could be, for example, where you're born. It could be your order of birth. It could be how you're parented. All kinds of different experiences. But also what goes into your backpack are what I would call traumatic experiences. Perhaps as a child, you were bullied very badly by somebody. And what you tend to do is you throw it into your backpack purely because you want to keep safe. That's why unconscious bias can be a very good thing, because without even you realizing it, it is there to keep you safe. So you then allow yourself to carry this around with you. But what you might then do is completely, let me put it into an example situation actually. So let's imagine as a child, you are bullied very badly by somebody from England. And I'm speaking to the Australians now. If I can think of an example in India, you're bullied very badly from, I don't know, somebody from Bengal, and you happen to be studying in Rajasthan. So as a result, you were so badly bullied and you were so hurt, you've thrown it into your backpack. Now, as far as you're concerned, you really don't like all Bengalis or all English, depending on who the person is who's bullied you. So now, fast forward to today, you're at university and maybe your professor comes from Bengal or from England. Or it could be that in your class, obviously it's a mixed international community, you've got students in your class who are from that particular place that bully came from. Now the chances are, because of what's in your backpack, that you will instinctively, unconsciously, not have anything to do with them. And if it's your tutor, you won't learn the way you can learn. That's the disadvantage of putting it in your backpack. Because not all English or not all Bengalis or not all whatever race ethnicity you want to call it, are bullies or bad. But because of that one experience that was so traumatic for you personally, you can't help it. You just shove it in there and you forget that it's there. You forget that you even had that experience because you were maybe 10 years old and now you're 25. And so you don't think about it. But equally, it's there and you think it's there to protect you. So sometimes it's a good thing, but sometimes it's not necessarily a good thing. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to reiterate, it can be a means of self-protection, almost a means of dealing with trauma, but also something that can significantly hinder people going into their future experiences.
Exactly. Because the kind of choices you make, right? And then what you've done essentially is that because of certain experiences in your life, you have put an entire group or a nation or a job or anything into a box, locked it up and thrown the key away. And you haven't allowed yourself the opportunity to explore that any further.
No, that completely makes sense to me. And I think you addressed also how it influences the quality of the decisions that we will make in the future because of this hypothetical backpack that we carry. In one of my favorite books, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, he mentions the term noise as this invisible problem. And he writes about this when he's talking about studies based on judgments. To summarize quite briefly, he refers to the idea of reducing noise in the decision-making process. So given your experience working with large organizations and in the domain of leadership, how should we go about making decisions when in a group setting, taking account this concept of noise or this judgment that we have?
Yeah. So essentially, because what Daniel Kahneman is saying, if I were to say it slightly differently, but it's saying exactly what you're saying, is that here's our brain, right? We can't leave our brain behind based on what we're doing for the day. Today, actually, my brain's taking the day off because I'm very tired. Well, it doesn't work like that. Wherever you go, the brain goes with you. But what's interesting is that you've got two parts of this brain of yours which you may not be aware of. So the back part, not the right and the left, which a lot of people talk about, but the back is what's called the old reptilian brain. And the front is the new neocortex brain. And these are not my words. These are words that have been used to describe it. Now, what does the old reptilian brain do? So the old reptilian brain is what is called your fast unconscious brain. So when you are looking at something and you jump to a conclusion, maybe it's to keep you safe, or maybe it's something else. So for example, if I were if I were to make an ugly face and point a finger at you, and I say, what does that mean? Your old reptilian brain will immediately say, oh, it means you're angry with me, or you're saying that I've done something wrong, or that's something like that. And then if I said to you, can you give me the answer to 65 multiplied by 322? You'll say, hang on a minute, what? And you'll stop. And then you'll get a pen and paper, or you'll get a calculator, or whatever you choose to do, and you will use your new neocortex brain, and you will then answer my question. Now we have both brains. We don't leave one behind. So how do we shut out the noise that Daniel Kahneman is suggesting is about stopping. And it's about using your frontal new neocortex brain rather than just going with what you say is your instinct and jumping to a conclusion. So stop, slow down, and think. But guess what? That's a much easier said than done, because most of us are running around frantic lives, getting on with what we're doing, and we don't stop and slow down. So that's what I mean by canceling out the noise.
So just to kind of unpack that, we stop, we slow down, and almost reflect on our thinking, whether that be a bias, a preference, whatever kind of influence our past or our trauma may have had on our judgments of people. But how exactly do we do that? What's the process?
Well, the chances are that you won't, because we're only human beings, and you will jump to a conclusion. And you might even say something that is hurtful or upsetting. But at least what you can do is reflect. Because reflection, what I think from my perspective, is often the key. You know, you say something, you think something, and then you reflect back on it and say, why did I think that? Why did I jump to that conclusion? Was that right? Was that fair? Or depending on the situation, and if you're amongst friends and trusted family or friends, you can actually, rather than reflecting by yourself, you can say it out loud with them and say, you know what, I just said this and I just thought this, and that was really weird. I wonder why I did. So it's about open, honest conversations, either with yourself or with people that you trust.
Absolutely. You mentioned the old reptilian brain and the neofrontal, sorry,
Neocortex, yeah.
neocortex. So coming from a neuroplasticity perspective, I am a psychology student. So just to kind of understand this a bit further, in neuroplasticity, we see the brain itself as a neutral organ, and it being an organ that takes the shape of whatever the mind rests upon. So we separate the mind and the brain. Would you agree that, like in neuroplasticity, we can rewire and unwire perceptions we have? Or are
Absolutely.
some biases or perceptions too deep rooted?
No, it depends on how hard you can work at it. So if we were going to be really simplistic and talk about neuroplasticity as just literally plasticine, which you can stretch, the more you work at it, the more it will become malleable. It is not easy because some, and you are still, I'd like to say without sounding ageist, young. And therefore, I will hope that you don't have so much in your backpack that is so deep-rooted that it's going to be hard for you to challenge it. But all of us have stuff in our backpack, and it's up to us whether you want to challenge it or you want to just keep it there to keep you safe. Because it depends on our life experiences. But if you genuinely have the motivation and you feel that it is the right thing to do to become a better human being, which may sound cheesy and idealistic, but I really believe that, then I think it is about working at it. It doesn't happen overnight. You've got to keep at it. It may take years. So, but that doesn't mean you just suddenly stop. So yes, the short answer is yes.
So you mentioned also just now that it's something that keeps us safe. We keep these things in our backpack to keep us safe.
Some of them, yes.
Some of them, yes. But if we're keeping these things in our backpack to keep us safe, when we go through this process of becoming conscious of our unconscious bias, does that not make a lot of people in your experience quite uncomfortable? Is it quite an unsettling experience? And how do you combat
absolutely.
that?
You've got to be very brave. If you're going through any kind of emotional turmoil at the moment, I wouldn't suggest you look in your backpack. You've got to be in a good space mentally and be calm with yourself and you're focused, you're getting on with stuff. Then you can look in your backpack. And then you can acknowledge there are some things in there that are really not relevant anymore. And you can just flush it down the toilet or whatever you want to do with it. And there are others that you feel that need to be there. So it's now become a conscious bias, but it's there because you have said in your own mind that it's important to you that it's there. Because you think genuinely in your heart that it keeps you safe. And the point is none of us have the right to tell you what is right or wrong on how you manage your own conscious or unconscious biases. Because each of us have our own stories and our own narrative. So we don't have that right to say, how dare you? How can you be so rude about X, Y, Z? You don't know what's going on in their backpacks or their lives.
So almost our backpacks are these tools we carry along on our journey. Very interestingly put. To add to that, these experiences, our background, our culture, these kinds of inherent biases that we might have, a lot of which, would you say, build up our identity? And if this unconscious bias is a preference, then would you make a correlation between identity and the bias?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I mean, if I think about why I went down this path of working with this particular subject, there are lots of reasons, but certainly one example that I can give you is, so I was born and brought up in India. And I moved to London in my 20s. So in other words, these are my words, choice of words, I came fully formed. I didn't come as a child. I came with a very strong sense of my own identity. I have now lived longer in London than I have in India, but I still see myself as Indian. And if anyone, the metaphorical taxi driver anywhere in the world says, where are you from? I say I'm Indian. I always say I'm Indian. I live in London, but I'm Indian. And it doesn't matter what passport I hold, but that is my identity. So now I arrive in this city and I meet many people who look like me, in other words, South Asian, my color skin, who don't have that same sense of identity, purely because they have had very different narratives of growing up. Some people who look like me have never even been to India because they came from East Africa, for example, or from Mauritius, or from Uganda. And then they moved to London. Some are people of second or third generation who lived here for forever and have very little connection. And I then began to think, my gosh, what does that then mean to each of us in terms of identity? And if I were to summarize, for me personally, I found that being very comfortable in my own identity really helps me with not having a very big backpack or a very heavy backpack. Whereas I think and this is not a judgment or a criticism, but each of us come with our own stories. And therefore, some of us may not have that same strong sense of identity. And if we don't, that can impact on how we see the world, which then means that it can impact on what kind of unconscious biases we may have.
To kind of flip the question as well, do you feel like addressing or looking inside our backpack, does that threaten our identity in some way? Can it threaten our identity?
So we don't know what's in there, right? We don't know what's in your...
For example, you mentioned you growing up in India and then moving to London. So let's say in this hypothetical person's backpack, they have this kind of agenda bias, for example, in their backpack. So if that's a deep-rooted part of my identity and I look and I acknowledge that that is in my backpack, do you feel like that could threaten my sense of self or my identity?
I mean, see, that's why it's a very brave thing to look at your backpack, you see. It doesn't come easy. And the thing is, if you're, how do I put it? I think threatening your identity, if you feel that it is going to threaten your identity and make you feel less, so then don't look in your backpack. Keep safe. Take care of yourself. That's number one. I think you need to be questioning who you are, how you perceive the world. What is it about your identity that influences you? The good, the bad, and the ugly. But you can't do that unless you are feeling that this is the right thing to do in terms of your own emotional and mental wherewithal. So if you're feeling in any way threatened by the choices you're making, then don't do it.
I think that's a really interesting distinction that you made, that it needs to be coming from a safe, encouraging space almost, and a supportive space.
It's very important.
So while I was doing some research, in one of your past interviews, you mentioned that a part of the unconscious bias associated with gender lies within the language that we use. So the example that I think you gave in this interview was, you said a few words, I think it was like supportive, caring, emotional. And you said, think about whether most people would think about a man or a woman. Another example I'll give you is in Melbourne at the moment, we see the introduction of pedestrian crossing lights that are depicted by a red woman instead of a red man, or things like this. So I have a deep interest in linguistics as well, and this led me to question the role of language in the unconscious bias. So does the bias differ between speakers of different languages? And more so, will we see this bias diminish slowly as languages become more gender neutral? So when I say languages becoming more gender neutral, what I mean by that, for example, in French, we see French is generally a dichotomous language. We have the feminine and the masculine word classes, but we see so we see the introduction of a more inclusive, more gender neutral terms. So do you think this will affect our bias, or will we see this affect the bias of future generations?
Well, it's a fascinating question that you've asked. So few things coming into my head. So let me just try and make sure I remember to say it all. The first part, when you were talking about the fact that, when you shut your eyes and say, think a person who's emotional and sympathetic and nurturing, and what gender do you think? And I'm not going to wait for your answer, but you know where I'm going with that. So way back in 1980, a researcher in the United States, her name is Sandra Bem, B-E-M, created something called the gender schema theory. And you can Google it. And it's a simple questionnaire not questionnaire, no, it's a questionnaire. I think there are, I've forgotten now, 60 or 70 words where you are asked to mark yourself from 1 to 7 against words like nurturing or assertive or strategic or good listener or words like that. And then you plot yourself onto a graph where you plot yourself into one of 4. Male sex typed, female sex typed, gender, hang on, let me just think, androgynous and undifferentiated. Now, I'm really summarizing where people do PhDs on this, and I'm spending 30 seconds explaining it. But what essentially she was saying way back in 1980 is that whether you're man or woman, gay or straight, is not the point. So it is not about, at that point of time, she did not work with transgender folk. So she only talks about the sexuality in terms of gay or straight and whether it's man or woman. And she says that is not the point. It is how your mind works in terms of your own unconscious about language and how your values are and so on. And therefore, because of who you are and how you see yourself, so it goes back to your earlier point about identity, you may assume that women should behave like a certain way or men should behave like a certain way. Now, the second part of what you said was more specifically about language. And I love the idea of words and language. And it just so happens that I read an article yesterday, which actually, fortunately, might still be lying here. Yes, it is. Lisa Feldman Barrett wrote a book called, what is it called? How Emotions Are Made, in 2017. And what she says is, and she works with the brain. She's a neurosurgeon, looks at the brain and language and so on. And what I found really interesting is she was talking about emotions. And she was saying there are many countries in the world that don't have a word for certain emotions, like fear, for example, or anger, for example. So I'm linking it now back to our unconscious or our unconscious biases in terms of language. And if you think about that, and so the example she gives is that you've got palpitations in your stomach. Your heartbeat is going up because you're about to go into an exam, let's say. You might use the word, I'm scared or I'm frightened. But she says that's because you put that word in, then your unconscious allows you to become frightened or scared. I hope I'm making sense. I thought it was fascinating. In fact, if any of you follow me on LinkedIn, I've actually posted that. It's lying on my desk purely because I posted that particular article that I read. And I thought, I haven't read the book, but I only happened to read the article. So the whole idea of language and how our own unconscious and our own culture and our own identity and all of these things, without realizing it, will even influence a particular word like angry or fearful or happy. And then we put emotion into that. So, I mean, it's a bigger topic and it's a fascinating question you've asked, but I kind of have addressed what you asked, I think.
So does this mean that with future generations that we'll see kind of a shift in the way that we approach certain biases? So for example, maybe 2 generations ahead, I'm hoping that gender equality and these kinds of notions, this kind of thinking will become more prevalent. Does this mean that we'll see different unconscious biases?
That's a good question. Yeah, because unconscious bias never goes away. You can't expect to have a level playing field because that will be a boring world to live in anyway. You've got to expect to jump to conclusions, to have narrative, to have experiences, and we will always have stuff, different kind of stuff in our backpack. So if you're thinking gender and specifically, I would agree with you. I think the way things are going, more and more, both in the West and in India, people are working towards more gender neutrality. May not happen in your generation, but could be by the time your children or your grandchildren, I'm sorry to say that because you're like 22 years old or whatever age you might be, but it'll take time. It will take time. And at the moment, the pendulum has swung and has swung to the place where people are hyper aware and hyper vigilant about trying to be gender equal. But what we want, obviously, is just normal. That we don't have to be vigilant, we don't make mistakes, we don't jump to conclusions. So you're going to be the teachers, because not people of my age, people of your age who will be the teachers for the next generation. So, it might happen before any of you die. Could happen in the next, say, 80 years, who knows?
Very interesting to think of, it being something that's that far down the line.
It will take time, because the whole idea of gender neutrality, you've started from the Neanderthals, don't forget. when you're talking about something about gender, don't think of it as a modern context, because the Neanderthals, who didn't even have language or words or emotions the way you and I are thinking about it, those days and today, men have the strength to go up there and kill the meat and bring it in. Women have the physical ability to be pregnant, to carry the baby, to breastfeed the baby, to nurture the baby. Those two things will never go away. That's just how it is. And therefore, from then on, men have taken certain roles and women have taken certain roles. You can't expect those roles to change. You don't want those roles to change. You don't want men to be pregnant and women to be going and killing the tiger or whatever you want to visualize. You want those roles to still remain. But in amongst that, you want the acceptance that we are still equal in so many other ways. So it's about trying to break away the stereotypical expectations of what a woman should and can do and what a man should and can do.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. My next question to you is regarding the misuse of the unconscious bias. So as the notion of the unconscious bias has been brought to light, do you feel like there has been any misuse regarding the theory, whether that be of the implicit association test?
I wouldn't use the word misuse, no. I think every single person who's trying to do something about the unconscious bias, they're doing a good thing. Mazarin Banaji, and I forgot the other gentleman's name, who created the implicit association test 22 years ago, were, in my opinion, frontrunners and extremely forward thinking in the idea of creating artificial intelligence to analyze how our brain works. That's pretty much what they're doing. In the recent past, they've got a bad rap. But if you think about the brain and how the brain works, and I don't know if any of you know what the IAT is. So essentially, it's a free test that's created by Harvard University, where you look at words and pictures under different headlines. So for example, race, which is black versus white, or gender versus man versus woman, and so on. And you need to have two good hands. If you've got a fractured hand or one hand doesn't work, you can't do this test. And you're using one finger in each hand and you're clicking a button on your computer. Now, don't forget, your button is not clicked unless your brain is telling you to click it. So the point of what they were trying to research is, can your brain recognize such deeply embedded unconscious bias that we're talking about a millisecond of a millisecond, split second, takes longer to click that button than it is for another word. That is all they're doing. And because they've been doing this for 22 years, they've got a lot of stuff in terms of data that they can throw back at you when you've completed your test. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? When I completed, I thought, hang on, that doesn't make sense. Actually, I got to do it again. My wrist wasn't working properly, and so on. These are things that people are doing and are continuing to do, where they are helping us become more aware that unconscious bias is not a new phenomena. People in 1970 were doing research on perception bias, which is one of the 150 types of unconscious biases. Now, perception bias, simply put, is you look at somebody and how you communicate and what you think of them instinctively will influence them on how they respond to you. So you look at somebody who is beautiful or somebody who you don't think is beautiful, and you react differently. As an example, I remember in our home, this is a very old story, 5-6 years ago, we have what I call sash windows. So you pull up the window, and so in between the two windows, there was a moth that was stuck. And I remember saying to my son, oh, there's a moth stuck. We should try and let it escape. And he said, oh, but it's only a moth. And I said, no, if it were a butterfly, what would you do? It's our perception bias. So you look at something that is beautiful, you want to make more of an effort to make a change. Well, the moth escaped, I'm happy to announce. We helped it live. But I don't believe that people are trying to work with an unconscious bias for the wrong reasons. I'm not suggesting that what they've done is doing the right amount of research or done enough research. I don't know who these people are that are in your head. You mentioned the IAT, I responded to that. Perhaps you have other ideas in your head, I don't know. But I think anything that is helping us become aware that we have influences that we are not aware of and that we can try and address that is not a bad thing. It just depends on how it's done. The how sometimes bothers me. And depending on the situation, what you do not want to do is put people off the idea of becoming more inclusive, or putting people on the defensive, or people thinking, oh my God, I'm such a horrible person, and berating themselves and beating themselves up. If you get that as an outcome, then you're going down it the wrong way. So it's about how rather than the whys.
I think that was very eloquently explained. Thank you. I think especially when you said the results and the how is important. So whether certain testing, you know, labels people as a misogynist or a racist or something like that, would that be where you think that the how is incorrect?
Again, I don't know which testing you're talking about, because I wouldn't suggest that the IAT does that. I don't think you're considered misogynist or racist, because don't forget, unconscious bias is not static. It is fluid. And if you do a test today and you are considered to be unconsciously positively biased towards men rather than women, depending on your gender, it doesn't matter, or unconsciously biased towards white people as opposed to black people, that doesn't make you misogynist or racist. That makes you unconsciously biased towards one over the other today. You are now consciously aware of it. Therefore, hopefully, you will reflect and work on it. If you then say, hey, yeah, you know what, I'm a king of the castle, I hate all black people, or I hate all women, or whatever it is, and that's what you continue doing, then you are a misogynist or a racist. It is your actions. A test is not going to make you do that. A test is only helping you become a bit more self-aware, that's all.
Absolutely. Thank you for clarifying that. You mentioned also the idea of it being kind of a form of artificial intelligence, and that leads me to my next question. With regards to the bias and the constant evolution of technology and research in the area, there's a technology called machine learning that I came across in my research. And it essentially allows AI programs to identify subtle patterns and pinpoint the exact places where bias crops up in the hiring process. What are your thoughts on this?
Not a bad thing. I mean, you probably know about this particular example. So I think it was early 70s or late 70s. The New York Philharmonic Orchestra was finding that they had very few women in their orchestra. So what they did is they did blind recruitment. So what does blind recruitment mean for a philharmonic orchestra? They had a large curtain. Not only did they have a large curtain, they told the people who were coming to be interviewed not even to wear shoes, because often women and the way they walk and the shoes they wear, as opposed to men and the way they walk and the shoes they wear, you can differentiate whether it's a man or a woman. Because there were a lot of unconscious biases that women can't play the double bass or men can't play the whatever. I mean, I don't know enough about instruments, but there were all these opinions that women can't play certain instruments and men can't play certain instruments. Long story cut short, it exponentially, the number of women who were hired in the New York Philharmonic Orchestra increased because they were recruiting without seeing. In other words, they were recruiting genuinely hearing the skill that needed to be heard. So do you really genuinely have that X skill? Now in music, you can do that. And they're continuing to do that, by the way. But you can't in other kinds of recruitment. If you're trying to recruit an academic, or if you think more about, say, for example, if an academic has to assess students' work, how do you do that? I would recommend that they try and do it blind. Don't look at, because now everybody types, so you can't, it's not about recognizing handwriting. Don't look at the person's name. See if you can pick up that pick up that document and assess it purely based on the merits of what they've written, rather than what their name is, because that will influence you. Therefore, the long answer to your short question about machine learning and blind recruitment and so on, I think is a good thing. I know somebody based in London who has a firm that specifically works with blind recruitment. And that, what I mean by blind recruitment is artificial intelligence, where they look at certain aspects. But then sooner or later, you will still have to have a face-to-face interview, because that final interview will be face-to-face, and then unconscious bias will kick in. So pluses and minuses, you've got to try, you've got to keep at it. You can't say it's all bad. You can't just have a robot interviewing you. How is that going to work? Because there are now interviews happening, I've read, where you can be interviewed by a robot. And the candidate who's interviewed has found it extremely difficult because they are used to seeing a human being and getting the eye contact and the body language and responding accordingly, which is part of our unconscious bias. So you see, there's no right and wrong here. We've got to keep exploring.
So does that mean that in the workplace that we cannot have a bias-free environment?
Pardon me, say that again?
So in the workplace, in HR and recruitment, does that mean that we cannot see a bias-free environment, that our decisions, our judgments inherently have to be biased in some way or the other?
Yeah, obviously they are. It's based on our experiences, based on the value of the company culture. All of that is influencing the HR department making the decisions they're making, obviously. So we have to recognize that. And then we have to make a decision on whether we want to maintain that or try and address it.
So as we see the increased prevalence and the recognition of the unconscious bias, or the consciousness of the unconscious bias, we see a lot of training programs and things like this emergent in the domain of this bias. How do we determine whether these programs are effective?
Yeah, no, good question, because it's very difficult to acknowledge or to recognize how effective a program can be with something as touchy-feely as one's own emotions and reactions to a situation. So if the invitation to support the organization for training is because of a specific problem, so in other words, there is high attrition, for example, and therefore we would like to have unconscious bias training to try and reduce, to assess how recruitment is done and lower the attrition, the chances are you can actually monitor that and you will be able to see within a year or two whether that has made a difference. If it is for just being a more inclusive organization, then what I would recommend is that the leaders or the influencers of the organization have regular conversations with their employees to keep this particular topic on the agenda all the time. You cannot go into a training room and have one training session and then expect the employees to say, that's it, tick, I'm done, I'm organized, I've sorted myself. It doesn't work like that. It's an ongoing lifetime, I mean it, lifetime learning process. So just having one training course is not going to make any blind bit of difference. It's got to come from within the organization to support the ideas that have been discussed and what's going on. And another way of addressing it, you were talking about machine learning, and I should have thought of that to add. So Culture-lytics, the other company that I'm the co-founder of, we've created an artificial intelligence platform that looks at culture, behavior, and organization. So what we're doing with them is we use an AI platform and we speak to all the employees like a questionnaire, and we ask them certain questions. And because we have got algorithms of many thousands of different algorithms, we look at their headline, what are they looking for, what are their needs in that company, get the answers from that question, use the algorithms, and then it tells us what are the specific areas where they can be supported for unconscious bias training or any other interventions. So then when we are coming in and offering any kind of training, we're doing it for the right reasons because the employees themselves have said, this is what we want to support us grow and become more inclusive, rather than the leaders of the organization thinking, tick, 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 let's do that. And therefore that has its own advantages.
Absolutely. And I think that would be a far more profound and deep-rooted impact if it comes directly from the employees rather than the leaders of the organization.
And then using AI and machine learning, we also equalize the fact that there is obviously bias between how they've answered and what they've said. And so there's more of a robust, informed opinion.
That's incredible. I can't imagine the work that would have gone into creating something like that.
Yeah,
it fascinates me.
Very exciting.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the future in this area. It seems to be a bright one. While reading up, I also came across that you were quite well versed in neurolinguistic programming. How does your understanding of neuro-linguistic programming influence your application or you addressing the bias also in the way that you work? How do they correlate in the work that you do?
Completely, they're like that. They completely correlate. Because neuro-linguistic programming essentially means, what is your brain saying to your mouth, to the language that you use? I want to be very simple so that we all understand that. So what are the words I'm choosing to use? It goes back to the language bit that you asked much earlier. And it is very much about what kind of unconscious biases might you have that use certain words instead of other words. And so it's being aware that if you want to get the best out of a situation, you need to choose certain words. Actually, this article that I read yesterday had a fantastic example of what I would call neurolinguistic programming. Let me just quickly skim read it so I can read it out to you. So I put it in my LinkedIn example. So there was this woman who was going for a, where is it? Here we are, found it. So my daughter was testing for a black belt in karate. Her sensei, I'm assuming sensei is her tutor, was testing, was a 10th degree black belt. So this guy is like a big, powerful, scary guy. She's having real high arousal, but he doesn't say to her, calm down. He says, get your butterflies flying in formation. That changed her experience. Her brain could have made anxiety, but it didn't. It made determination. That's a classic example of NLP or neurolinguistic programming. If he had said calm down when her butterflies are going and she's totally petrified, it would have made things much worse. But he was aware that she was nervous and he said, get your butterflies in formation. I thought that was a brilliant example. But let me just quote that rather than give you my own example. That's an example of NLP.
Yeah, absolutely.
Language you use.
That's incredible. Thank you for outlining that. That makes it crystal clear what you're trying to say. What I'd like to, you work in the area of leadership development. You work with a lot of organizations. We talked when we last spoke about harnessing the narrative or the role of storytelling and the role of positive storytelling. Can you talk a bit about how the two relate? What kind of things can we do to harness our narrative or to take control of the story?
So it depends on what the story is, right? That's probably the first answer. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the same Daniel Kahneman that you mentioned earlier, who wrote Thinking Fast and Slow, he also talks about how the brain is wired and the fact that he really believes, based on his research, that many of us are born, our brain is born half empty or half full. So what I mean by that is we are naturally positive thinking or naturally negative thinking. That's just how we're wired. So when we're talking about harnessing our narrative, if you happen to be born negative thinking, and Daniel Kahneman says of himself, that's how he is, it's much harder. And you've got to work much, much, much harder at harnessing your narrative and turning it around to make it work for you. If, on the other hand, if you have the good fortune of being half full, well, lucky you, hey, that's great. But it doesn't come easy for those of us who might be born, like Daniel Kahneman, half full, negatively wired. This is what I'm saying. I'm being very simple in my language here. Because when you want to harness your narrative, it is about the phrase that you're using, if I were to make it say differently, it's just about looking at your experiences, your narrative, your life experiences, and turning it around to make it work for you. That's what you mean, or I think you mean, that's what I mean anyway, by harnessing your narrative. Now, if you're naturally negative thinking, it's very hard work to do that. But that doesn't mean you can't. You've got to work at it much harder than the lucky ones who are born half full. And you've got to keep at it like a mantra. And when your brain starts talking to you, because we all have what we call self-talk in our heads, and we're saying, oh, for God's sake, that's so miserable and I'm so unhappy. As soon as you've said that in your head, you've got to stop and say, no, let me rewire that. Actually, it's not so bad. Things could be so much worse. I know I'm good at what I'm good at, and then start saying positive sentences to yourself. I mean, there are examples which have been proven where people have literally stood in front of the mirror. In fact, for those of you who watch Hindi movies, one of my podcasts is with this very well-known Bollywood film actor, Vidya Balan. And she says in her podcast interview how she literally would stand. She says, people would laugh at me, but I'd stand in front of the mirror and I would say, I am good and I am amazing and I'm going to be amazing. And go out there and, I'm paraphrasing what she said, you can hear it, and harnessed her narrative and turned it around into something positive. Because she was, I'm assuming, based on her conversation with me, more half empty and had to work harder at becoming half full. So we can't do, some of us can't do it so easily.
So when we talk about the unconscious bias, or even addressing our narrative, like you mentioned, or being able to not take control, but be able to use our narrative to make it work for us, like you said, it's a constant process. It needs to constantly be reiterated over and over again. Yeah. So what are some things you do on a daily basis to help you with this? Some tricks for our viewers?
Fortunately for me, I now know that I'm half full. That's the way I'm born. That's my luck. So I genuinely see the world as a happy, good place. And I'm always instinctively looking at things positively rather than negatively. That's just how I'm wired. So I'm lucky, hooray. Not everybody can be as lucky. So that's number one. Number two is that this subject genuinely has interested me for a long time. Well over 20, 25 years now. So my reading, I'm just reading a weekend magazine, this thing that I was reading from, and I'm reading an article like this and it jumps up at me. Whereas it may not jump up at you. You might just read it and you may not even think any further. But to me, all of these things are amazing, fascinating, interesting ideas of what I believe is the way we should all try and work and think. So there's no mantra for me. There is no standing in front of the mirror and saying good things like some people need to do. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. It depends on where you are and how you are. But I say, simply put, I don't have a mantra, but I do know, in terms of our own emotional resilience and trying to harness our own life stories, it is very important for us to challenge, to reflect, to try and learn from our mistakes rather than live in the past, rather than, whether it's a good past or bad past, that's not the point, but rather than living in the past, live in the present. Don't live for day after tomorrow, don't live for day for yesterday, live in today. And a lot of us are not aware that living in today is a really good place to be. We keep thinking about tomorrow, we keep thinking about yesterday. And if nothing else, all of us should have learned from COVID that there's no point planning for tomorrow. Who would have known on January 1st, 2020, that this would be the world the whole world is going to live in, or most of the world, 90% of the world? Who would have recognized that? And so acknowledge that, embrace that, rather than fight it.
I'm intrigued. You mentioned that you've been interested in this topic for a long time. What was the first thing that kind of triggered your interest in this area? Do you remember?
Actually, it's probably more than 25 years ago. Much before I started my own company, I remember I was working in learning and development within an organization, and I was asked to design a workshop on, I don't think this was a trigger. I have no idea what the trigger was, but there are lots of different things in my head. But I was asked to design a workshop on time management. And I started researching and designing this workshop. And to me, the first thing I said at that workshop when everybody came in is I said, you know what, there's no such thing as time management. They said, I thought we come to the wrong course. Da, 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 da. I said, no, you come to the right course. But it's not about time management. It's about you as human beings and how you influence the day that you've got and how you manage your time. So what does that then mean? It's about our unconscious and how we are influencing whatever we do. So our unconscious biases even influence us in how we manage our time. And the other example would be, if you want to call it a trigger, is about talking to people who look like me, who've never been to India, who have a different sense of identity, a different kind of influence. And what does that mean to them? What is their narrative? All of these things, these life experiences start making me think about what you and I are now calling unconscious bias.
That's fascinating. As a young person, as a psychology student, to think about your journey, 25 years ago, and how you've developed that into something that you live and breathe every day.
Actually, it would be more than that. It's not even 25, it's all my life. I'll tell you why I'm saying that. Because I grew up in India, but I know in reflection that I grew up in my immediate family. So my parents, and we are 3 siblings, my brother, sister, and I. And I'm the youngest of 3. And in my immediate family, we genuinely, with the benefit of hindsight, I can say this, grew up in an inclusive, accepting, non-judgmental, liberal family. So what does that mean in real terms for India for the 70s, which is when I grew up? Sexuality, no big deal. Gay people, straight people, no big deal. Religion, any religion you like, no big deal. Gender, eldest person was a boy. Girls were given the same importance as the boy. What else? These were big caste. I had no idea what my caste was. I genuinely did not. My father had changed his surname as when he was a freedom fighter, so that our surname Tharoor doesn't say what caste we are. So, and I didn't know. When you're growing up, you take it for granted. Your upbringing, you take for granted. So it's only when I arrived in this country in my 20s and I look back, I realized, my God, I was lucky. I was so privileged to have the upbringing that I did. Not everybody has that luck. There were friends of my age growing up in the same city as me who would not have had the same experiences. So it's important to acknowledge that and recognize that we're all different. So I just did it, just instinctively, without even thinking about it. Plus, I'm half-wired. I mean, positively wired, not negatively.
That's incredible. Your story does not cease to amaze me. It's incredible. Your background, your upbringing, and to see the influence and the ways that you use storytelling and your examples to make the point that you make, it's unbelievable. The last question I'd like to ask you, keeping in account that you do have another meeting after this, what are some practical steps that we can take to address the unconscious bias? You did mention this earlier, but just to reiterate, and also you mentioned a few books, some articles, which I have noted down and we will attach to our YouTube Live link. But what are some books or articles that you recommend for people who are looking to look deeper into this topic?
I think just have an open mind and just constantly be, and this book that I've just read about, and I didn't know anything about it until yesterday when I picked up the Weekend magazine. So the point is there's lots out there. And I think keep an open mind. Look at this idea. I think, let me put it slightly differently. If you're wanting to try and think and understand the subject of unconscious bias, see this as a fun, interesting, unusual topic and subject, and something that you really want to learn and explore and understand. And why? Because it makes you a better human being. It influences your relationships and makes them stronger relationships. It helps you work better at your academics. It helps you become better leaders and become, and you're young, you're just starting out your life. So it's a good place to be in terms of understanding this topic for all the right reasons. Do not go down this path because somebody said to you, God, you're misogynist, God, you're racist, how dare you speak like that? Go and learn something more about unconscious. Don't go it for the wrong reasons. Do it because it's a fun topic and it really is fascinating and fun. It's about language, it's about narrative, it's about stories, and just live the life. So keep your ears pricked up, but don't beat yourself up about it. So when somebody says something that you may think is homophobic or racist or misogynist or anything you want, you could just gently respond and say, hey, that sounded kind of funny. Did you notice you said that? Because you heard it. But don't say, did you sound, and get all, all bullshit about it, because that's not what you want. So you're just speaking aloud. You're talking amongst friends and family. You're reading, you're exploring. I mean, the podcast that I've got out there, I've now got, how many have I got? 13 or 15 interviews, I can't remember. And each one of them tells you different stories. And there's that's my podcast. There's lots more out there. So explore, read, have an open mind, and have some fun with it.
Absolutely. And we will include the link to your podcast as well under our YouTube comments for those of you watching. Also, I think, like you said, that opening the backpack can be uncomfortable. It can be unsettling. So make sure that we're doing that in a comfortable space when we're ready, when we're feeling emotionally stable.
When you're ready. That is I'm glad you reminded us of that again, because that's really, really important. Do not, your emotional and mental well-being is paramount. Be selfish, and I use the word in a nice way. Do the right thing by yourself. Don't beat yourself up, and then have some fun and think about what the world has to offer us.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for taking your time out and sharing such invaluable insights with us. We're truly lucky, and I'm honestly so moved by everything that you do. You're an idol. I'm inspired by you, to be very honest. And I'm excited to see what else you bring into this domain in the world of leadership development. So thank you again. Thank you so much on behalf of myself, our viewers, and also Jasol. Thank you so much.
Well, Sanskriti, I have to say that you are absolutely brilliant as an interlocutor. And I want to congratulate you on that. As you know, I've done lots of different interviews and conversations and all sorts, and you are up there with the best. You're fabulous. And you asked some superb, thoughtful, excellent questions. I mean, I really enjoyed this conversation with you. So I'm glad we have this opportunity. And all the very best to all of you, both the think tank, Jasol, and all the other students in whichever parts of the world. All the very best. Enjoy your time.
Thank you so much. That means the world. I'll end the meeting here. Thank you so much.